An astonishing outcome at Courtrai.
The French have been defeated. None believed it possible.
In the heart of the Middle Ages, at a time when the power of the knightly aristocracy seemed unshakable, an event took place that forever changed the rules of war. The cream of the French nobility, clad in the finest steel, faced off against a simple city militia of weavers, butchers, and craftsmen. The outcome of this encounter shook the foundations of the European world order. It was not just a battle, but a clash between two worlds, the world of feudal traditions and the world of the emerging urban bourgeoisie. On the one hand, there was honor, valor, and centuries-old military traditions. On the other, there was the desperate determination, discipline, and new, simple but effective weapons of the common people. This story is about how the economic power of ordinary people was able to withstand the military might of an entire kingdom. It proves that the course of history is determined not only by kings and commanders, but also by nameless heroes defending their homes and their right to freedom. Watch the video to the end to find out how ordinary craftsmen managed to destroy Europe's most elite army and why this battle was called the Battle of the Golden Spurs. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret that was the basis of the wealth of entire nations in the Middle Ages. It's not about gold or precious stones, but soft, pliable wool. It was the wool trade and cloth production that transformed Flanders, a small region in northern Europe, into one of the richest and most influential centers of the world at that time. The cities of Ghent, Ypres, and especially Bruges were medieval metropolises, centers of international trade and financial power. Their wealth was built on the labor of tens of thousands of weavers, dyers, and other craftsmen, united in powerful guilds. These people produced cloth of such high quality that it was bought throughout Europe, from England to Byzantium. The life of a simple weaver was hard and monotonous, subject to the strict rhythm of work at the loom. However, it was these people who formed the economic basis of the Flemish cities. Their guilds were not just trade unions, but real social institutions with their own rules, treasury, and even militia. Power in the cities formerly belonged to the patricians, a small circle of the wealthiest merchant families. They controlled the city councils and conducted business with the French crown, often to the detriment of the artisans. This internal conflict smoldered for decades, dividing the townspeople into two camps. Supporters of the Count of Flanders, who defended the region's independence, were called klauwaerts, from the Dutch word for claw, alluding to the claws of the Flemish lion on the coat of arms. Those who supported the French king were called leliards, from the lily on the French coat of arms. This division ran through the very heart of Flemish society. Guild craftsmen formed the backbone of the klauwaerts party. They saw French rule as a direct threat to their economic interests and urban freedoms. The patricians, the leliards, were closely linked to the French aristocracy and trade, so they preferred submission to the king. It was this confrontation between ordinary workers and the elite that would become the main driving force behind the coming events. The wealth created by the hands of the weavers gave them not only means, but also a sense of dignity. They were ready to defend their rights with weapons in their hands. This economic power of the guilds was something new for feudal Europe. Kings and barons were used to dealing with submissive peasants, not organized, wealthy, and self-confident townspeople. They did not yet understand that a new force was emerging before them, one capable of changing history. Tensions grew with each passing year, fueled by taxes, political intrigue, and the arrogance of the French nobility. There was a storm brewing, and everyone knew that an open confrontation was inevitable. The Battle of Courtrai would be the culmination of this long economic and social conflict. We are very interested in hearing your point of view. Do you think economic independence could have been the main reason for the desire for freedom in that era? Write about it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next episodes. Are you ready to learn the harsh truth about how the king's boundless ambition and arrogance led to one of the most humiliating and shocking defeats in the military history of medieval France? It all began, unsurprisingly, with the imperious desire of King Philip IV the Fair, one of the most powerful and ambitious monarchs of late 13th century Europe. to completely subjugate and absorb the wealthy textile-producing and rebellious Flanders, the Pearl of the North. This prosperous region was formerly his vassal under feudal law and part of the kingdom, but in practice behaved as a virtually independent rich state with its own laws, army, and diplomacy, which was unacceptable to the centralizing ambitions of the king, who dreamed of absolute power without exceptions and autonomies undermining his authority and treasury, which he wanted to replenish at the expense of the rich Flemish cities, whose taxes flowed past the royal treasury into the pockets of the local nobility and merchants. The Count of Flanders, Guy de Dampierre, tried desperately to maneuver and balance between the conflicting interests of his subjects, wealthy merchants and artisans demanding autonomy, and the harsh demands of his powerful suzerain, King Philip, who demanded obedience. He took the risky step of forming a secret alliance with King Edward I Longshanks of England, Philip's main geopolitical rival for influence in the region. This act of treason, from the point of view of vassalage, was the last straw that broke the camel's back for the hot-tempered French monarch, whose pride had been offended. The alliance with England was declared a rebellion and treason, giving the king a formal pretext for military intervention and annexation of the rebellious region by force, which he had been planning to do for a long time, waiting only for the right moment to strike, which Count Guy, with his careless alliance with the enemy, kindly provided on a silver platter. In 1297, the powerful French royal army, led by the kingdom's best knights, invaded Flanders under the pretext of punishing a rebellious vassal. Count Guy de Dampierre and his adult sons were treacherously captured during negotiations under guarantees of safety and imprisoned without trial in the gloomy Parisian prison of the Château de Châtelet. Flanders was unilaterally declared part of the royal domain of France by decree, and the harsh royal governor Jacques de Châtillon was appointed to rule the conquered territory with extraordinary powers of suppression. The occupation was total. French garrisons occupied all major cities, the local nobility was intimidated by arrests, and laws were replaced by royal edicts, turning autonomy into direct rule from Paris against the will of the population, which sowed the seeds of future rebellion in the hearts of the humiliated Flemish, deprived of their freedom with a stroke of the pen. The rule of the arrogant de Châtillon was marked by blatant arrogance towards the local population and the introduction of excessive taxes to replenish the royal treasury. French officials and soldiers behaved arrogantly in wealthy cities as conquerors in enemy territory, completely disregarding the centuries-old local laws, traditions, and customs of the Flemish. They looted, raped, and killed with impunity, knowing that the governor would cover for them. This naturally caused a dull but growing discontent and hatred among the common people, artisans and merchants who felt like slaves in their own country. Humiliation and exploitation created an explosive mixture of resentment and rage, which only needed a spark in leaders to turn into an open rebellion against the occupiers, whose patience was running out with each new outrage committed by the French. The leaders of the growing resistance against the French were two ordinary residents of wealthy Bruges, weaver Peter de Koninck and butcher Jan Breidel, both from the lower classes of society. They were charismatic orators with a gift for persuasion, and were able to rally thousands of discontented craftsmen from all guilds, weavers, tanners, butchers, blacksmiths, around them with their fiery speeches. Their secret night meetings in basements and passionate calls for armed uprising and the expulsion of the invaders found a warm response in the hearts of thousands of townspeople thirsting for revenge and freedom. De Koninck and Breidel were not military men, but popular tribunes, capable of turning scattered discontent into an organized movement with a purpose and a plan, which made them more dangerous than any knight to the French, who relied on fear and force but did not understand the power of popular anger, capable of crushing any army when suffering becomes more unbearable than fighting. The culmination of the accumulated hatred was a bloody event that went down in the history of Flanders as the Bruges Matins, the massacre of the French. On the night of May 18th, 1302, secretly armed groups of artisans numbering in the thousands suddenly and in a coordinated manner attacked the relaxed French garrison, which was carelessly stationed in the city without proper security. In order to reliably distinguish their own from strangers in the pitch darkness of the night, the rebels cunningly used the Flemish password Schild en Vriend, shield and friend, which the French, who did not know the language, were physically unable to pronounce correctly due to the specific sounds, thus giving themselves away. Anyone who could not repeat the password with the correct accent was immediately killed on the spot without mercy. Language became a weapon for identifying the enemy, more reliable than any uniform or banner in the darkness, where it was impossible to distinguish faces. The operation was carried out by the rebels with astonishing cruelty and military efficiency, unusual for untrained townspeople. The French garrison, numbering hundreds of soldiers, was almost completely wiped out, killed or taken prisoner in one night of carnage, and the hated Governor de Châtillon, awakened by the screams, barely managed to flee the city in his nightshirt, leaving everything behind. The sudden uprising in Bruges sent a powerful signal and set an example for the whole of occupied Flanders. The French could be defeated. They were not invincible. Fear was conquered by the first bloodshed in retaliation for humiliation. The success of Bruges inspired other cities to resist, showing that a people united by hatred and determination is stronger than professional soldiers, caught off guard and demoralized by the suddenness and ferocity of the attack by seemingly peaceful townspeople who turned into ruthless killers of the occupiers overnight. News of the bloody Bruges Matin and the massacre of the French spread throughout the region like wildfire, and other major cities in Flanders joined the general uprising one after another, expelling the garrisons. The inspired Flemish began feverishly gathering a militia of craftsmen and peasants, preparing for the inevitable bloody response and revenge of the insulted French king. They soberly understood that the proud Philip IV would never forgive such public humiliation and the massacre of his soldiers, and would inevitably send a huge punitive army to suppress the rebellion and make an example of them. The uprising was irreversible, either victory and independence, or defeat and total destruction in retaliation. There was no third way, which mobilized everyone to fight not for life, but for death, where compromise was impossible after the blood of the French nobility had been shed. The gathering of a scattered militia from the cities was carried out under the military leadership of the surviving members of the Count's family de Dampierre, William of Jülich, grandson of the captured Guy de Dampierre, and Guy of Namur, his son, who had been freed or had escaped from captivity. With their military experience and the legitimacy of the dynasty, they were able to quickly give the spontaneous popular uprising an organized military character with a unified command and strategy. Thus began the intense preparations for the decisive battle for the independence of Flanders against the professional French army. David against Goliath, where the outcome was unpredictable, but the Flemish were absolutely determined to fight to the end, giving them a chance at the impossible, victory of the townspeople over the knights, which was considered impossible in an era when heavy cavalry dominated the battlefields of Europe. What do you personally think? Is armed rebellion the only moral option for an oppressed people when their rights and freedoms are systematically trampled on by a foreign power, with no hope for peaceful change? But even the most righteous fury and just anger are absolutely useless without suitable effective weapons against armored knights. In the next fascinating chapter, you will learn in detail how an ordinary long stick with a metal spike, the goedag, became a deadly symbol of the Flemish Revolution and an equalizer of social classes. What I am about to show you was considered a weapon of the common people, but it was precisely this weapon that stopped the indestructible knightly cavalry. I am talking about the Goeden Dag, or Good Day, a unique weapon of the Flemish militia. Its name sounds ironic, because an encounter with it did not bode well for the French knights. Outwardly, the Good Day was a massive wooden club about 1.5 meters long, thickening towards the end. Its top was crowned with a long, sharp metal spike. This design made it a versatile weapon, combining the functions of a club and a short spear. It was the perfect weapon for an infantryman fighting against an armored horseman. A powerful, crushing blow with the thickened part could stun a horse, or even its rider. The sharp spike was designed to deliver precise stabbing blows to vulnerable areas of armor. The manufacture of the Goedentag did not require advanced technology or rare materials. Any village blacksmith or even a militiaman himself could make it. This simplicity and low cost made it possible to arm thousands of townspeople in a very short time, creating a massive and formidable army. The second key weapon of the Flemish was a long spear, or pike. Militiamen armed with pikes lined up in dense, deep formations known as schieldrons, or battalions. This wall of steel and wood was virtually impenetrable to cavalry attacks. The tactics of using this weapon required not so much individual skill as iron discipline and coordination. The Flemish trained for hours to act in unison, march in step, and maintain a wall of shields and pikes. Their strength lay in unity and organization. This weaponry and tactics were opposed by the classic knightly army. French knights were clad in expensive plate armor and armed with long lances and swords. Their main strength was a full-speed ram, capable of breaking through any defense. The opponent's philosophies of combat were completely different. The French nobility relied on individual valor, duels, and swift cavalry attacks. The Flemish artisans countered this with collective discipline, steadfast defense, and skillful use of simple but effective weapons. The French aristocrats looked down on the Flemish weapons, considering them peasant and unworthy. They were sure that their noble steel and war horses would easily sweep away this crowd of commoners. This overconfidence would be one of the main reasons for their future defeat. Thus, it was not just two armies that were to clash on the field at Courtrai, but two different military doctrines. One was outdated, based on the dominance of heavy cavalry. The other was new, heralding the coming era of infantry dominance on the battlefields of Europe. Guess what happened next, when the most powerful army in Europe met a militia of weavers? After the Brugge Matins, the Flemish army, numbering about 10,000 men, laid siege to Courtrai Castle, where the remaining French garrison had taken refuge. This is where King Philip IV's punitive army headed. The French army was led by one of the most experienced and renowned commanders of the time, Count Robert II d'Artois. He was a veteran of many wars and had a reputation as a brilliant tactician. Under his command was the cream of French knighthood, about 2,500 mounted knights and squires, the elite of the European aristocracy. In addition to heavy cavalry, the French army included several thousand infantrymen, including mercenary Genoese crossbowmen. The total strength of d'Artois' army reached 8,000 to 9,000 men. Although they were inferior to the Flemish in numbers, their qualitative superiority seemed undeniable. Robert d'Artois was absolutely confident of an easy and quick victory. He spoke contemptuously of the Flemish militia, calling them peasants and weavers. This aristocratic arrogance and underestimation of the enemy played a cruel joke on him. Approaching Courtrai on July 8th, the French commander saw that the Flemings had no intention of retreating or hiding behind the city walls. They came out into the open field and took up defensive positions. This decision surprised and delighted the Count d'Artois, who anticipated his knights trampling the infantry on the plain. The Flemish leaders, William of Jülich and Guy of Nemours, understood perfectly well that they had no chance in an open battle on flat terrain. Therefore, they carefully chose the location for the battle. Their position was not as simple as it seemed to the French at first glance. They positioned their troops on a small plateau, protected on the flanks and rear by natural barriers. But most importantly, several streams and rivers flowed directly in front of their front line, including the Groningen stream. The banks of these streams were marshy and crisscrossed with hidden ditches. The Flemings formed a single, deep and dense line, with their flanks resting on the streams. They stuck their pikes into the ground at an angle, turning their formation into a giant hedgehog. Behind the first line of pikemen were soldiers with halberds, ready to engage in battle. They deliberately left a seemingly convenient and flat section of the field in front of their center. According to their plan, this was where the main attack of the French cavalry was to be directed. It was a cunning trap based on perfect knowledge of the terrain. The French command, blinded by arrogance, failed to conduct proper reconnaissance. All they saw before them was a plain and a formation of infantry that they intended to easily defeat. The Flemish, however, were ready to wait and defend themselves, turning their enemy's strengths into weaknesses. What was this ingenious yet simple plan of the Flemish? The battlefield chosen by the Flemish was the key to their future victory. It was located northeast of the town of Courtrai, on the Groningen Plateau. At first glance, it was an ordinary plain, ideal for heavy cavalry, which misled the French command. However, the terrain was full of hidden surprises. It was crisscrossed by numerous streams, ditches, and channels left over from old peat excavations. The most significant of these was the Groningen stream. which flowed directly in front of the Flemish army's front line. The soil in the valleys of these streams was soft and marshy, especially after the recent rains. Even where the surface appeared dry, sticky mud was hidden under a thin layer of turf. For a heavy warhorse carrying a rider in full armor, such areas were extremely dangerous. The Flemish commanders knew every inch of this land. They positioned their army to make the most of these natural obstacles. Their single line of defense ran along the high ground, and all approaches to it were cut off by these treacherous streams and ditches. They formed a deep phalanx, bristling with pikes and halberds. The flanks of their formation were securely covered by the bends of the Lys and Grinningen streams, which ruled out the possibility of a flanking maneuver. They forced the French to attack head-on in the most disadvantageous position for them. The Flemish position was purely defensive. They had no intention of advancing and engaging in a maneuverable war, where the knightly cavalry would have the advantage. Their task was to withstand the first blow and force the enemy to get bogged down in the difficult terrain. Interestingly, the Flemish left several seemingly safe passages across the streams. These bridges were wide enough to tempt the French cavalry to attack. However, immediately beyond them lay the most boggy and sticky ground. It was a perfectly prepared defensive position that turned the plain into a deadly trap. Every element of the landscape was taken into account and used against the enemy. The Flemish did not just wait for the battle. They imposed their rules of the game on the enemy. The French, in turn, saw only what they wanted to see: open space and a crowd of infantrymen. Their reconnaissance, if it was conducted at all, was superficial. Confidence in their own superiority blinded them. Thus, even before the first sword strike, the Flemish gained a huge tactical advantage. They turned the battlefield into their main ally. All that remained was to wait for the enemy to walk into the trap set for them. What if everything you've been taught about medieval battles, where knights easily sweep away infantry, is not true? The Battle of Courtrai, which took place on July 11th, 1302, began with the traditional artillery preparation of the time. The French infantry and crossbowmen advanced and began firing at the Flemish positions. The Flemish steadfastly withstood the barrage, taking cover behind a wall of shields. They suffered some losses, but their formation remained intact. They did not respond to provocations, waiting for the main attack. After the artillery preparation, the French infantry went on the attack. The soldiers managed to cross the streams and engage in fierce fighting with the front line of the Flemish militia. At one point, the French even managed to push back the left flank of the Flemish. Seeing this initial success, Robert d'Artois made a fatal mistake. Blinded by his thirst for glory for his knights, he ordered the infantry to retreat. He did not want some rabble to steal the victory from the nobles. A trumpet sounded, calling back the infantry. This order caused confusion in the ranks of the attackers, who were forced to retreat under enemy fire, suffering losses. But for the Count d'Artois, this was unimportant. He was clearing the way for the main force, his heavy cavalry. And then came the moment that the entire French aristocracy had been waiting for. Thousands of knights in shining armor, on mighty war horses, lined up in several lines. Hundreds of banners and pennants of the most noble families of France fluttered above their heads. It was a magnificent and terrifying sight, designed to break the enemy's will at a glance. The knights lowered their visors, raised their long lances, and spurred their horses. The earth shook from the pounding of thousands of hooves. An avalanche of steel and fury rushed toward the seemingly thin line of Flemish infantry. To any observer, the outcome seemed a foregone conclusion. No infantry in the world could withstand such a blow. But invisible enemies lay in wait for this avalanche: streams, ditches, and boggy ground. The knights, gathering speed, did not immediately realize what trap they were rushing into. Their rapid advance began to slow. What happened when this indestructible wave of knights reached the hidden streams? The French knights' rapid attack began to fall apart as soon as they reached the hidden streams and marshy terrain. The horses, not expecting an obstacle, began to stumble and fall. Those who tried to jump over the ditches got stuck in the soft ground on the opposite bank. The powerful and monolithic formation turned into a chaotic cluster of horsemen trying to get out of the mud. The rear ranks, unable to see what was happening in front, continued to push forward, exacerbating the confusion. The perfectly planned attack turned into a disaster. The heavy war horses, the pride of knighthood, became their curse. Under the weight of a fully armored rider, they sank deep into the soft soil, becoming completely helpless. Some riders were thrown to the ground and could not get up under the weight of their own armor. The Flemish phalanx remained motionless, watching the events unfold. They allowed the chaos in the enemy ranks to reach its peak. Only when the French attack had completely stalled did they move forward. The Flemish formation remained intact. They slowly and methodically approached the helpless knights stuck in the mud. Now the advantage was entirely theirs. The French nobles found themselves in a terrible position. Deprived of their main advantage, speed and battering power, they became easy targets. Their long spears were useless in close combat, and their swords could not always reach the infantry. The Flemish, on the other hand, used their simple and effective weapons. With their long pikes, they pulled the horsemen from their saddles, and the soldiers with gwentags finished the job with their spiked clubs. The battle turned into a methodical beating of one of the best armies in Europe. The aristocrats, accustomed to the courteous rules of war, were confronted with the cold and calculating fury of the common people. The Flemish took no prisoners and were not interested in ransom. Robert d'Artois, seeing that the battle was lost, tried to organize resistance. Gathering the remnants of his personal guard around him, he made a desperate attempt to break through, but his detachment also got stuck in the swamp and was surrounded. The French commander fought to the last, but the forces were unequal. He fell, like many other representatives of the French nobility. His death finally broke the spirit of the French army. When the main forces of the French cavalry were put out of action, the Flemish launched a general offensive. They bypassed the knights stuck in the swamp and descended on the remaining French infantry and rearguard. This was the signal for complete defeat. The remnants of the French army, deprived of their command and seeing the destruction of their elite cavalry, turned and fled in disorder. The Flemish pursued them, completing the rout. The defeat was complete and unconditional. The battlefield was a horrific sight. Thousands of bodies covered the plain, especially in the area of the ill-fated streams. The losses of the French army were catastrophic, especially among the nobility. The Flemings showed an organization unheard of at that time. Instead of looting the fallen, they methodically walked around the battlefield, collecting trophies. Their main prize was golden spurs, a symbol of knightly dignity. More than 500 pairs of golden spurs were collected, belonging to the most noble knights and barons of France. This fact indicates that the Flemish destroyed not just ordinary soldiers, but the cream of the French aristocracy. That is why the battle went down in history as the Battle of the Golden Spurs. Among the fallen, in addition to Commander-in-Chief Robert d'Artois, were Constable of France Raoul de Neuf, Marshals Guy de Clermont and Simon de Melun, as well as dozens of other counts, viscounts, and lords. It was a national disaster for the French nobility. The Flemish militia, consisting of ordinary townspeople, achieved the seemingly impossible. They did not simply repel the attack, but completely destroyed a professional feudal army. This victory had enormous psychological significance. It showed that the era of the undisputed dominance of knightly cavalry on the battlefield was coming to an end. A well-organized and disciplined infantry, armed with simple but effective weapons, was a force to be reckoned with from now on. The collected golden spurs were triumphantly brought to Courtrai. They were hung in the local church of Our Lady, as a symbol of victory and an eternal reminder of the humiliation of the French aristocracy. They became a relic of the Flemish people. The victory at Courtrai immediately changed the political situation in the region. French rule in Flanders collapsed. The cities and the county regained their independence, which, however, would be challenged again and again in the future. The immediate result of the battle was the liberation of virtually the entire territory of Flanders from French troops. One by one, the cities expelled the French garrisons, and the power of the Count of Flanders was restored. The defeat was so crushing that King Philip IV simply did not have the strength to seek immediate revenge. The victory at Courtrai significantly strengthened the position of the guild craftsmen within the Flemish cities themselves. Their role in achieving victory was undeniable, and this gave them new political rights and influence. In many cities, the power of the patricians, the reliards, was weakened, and the guilds gained greater representation in the city councils. News of the battle spread throughout Europe, causing shock and amazement. The very fact that a militia of commoners could defeat an elite army of knights seemed incredible. Military theorists and commanders across the continent began to rethink their views on tactics. The Battle of Courtrai was one of the first in a series of battles in the 14th century, where infantry proved its superiority over cavalry. Later, the successes of English archers at Crécy and Poitiers and Swiss pikemen at Morgarten would confirm this trend. The era of knights was coming to an end. However, Flanders' triumph was short-lived. King Philip IV was not a man who could tolerate such humiliation. He spent several years gathering a new army and reorganizing his forces, learning from his defeat. In 1304, the French took revenge in the naval battle of Zierikzee, followed by the land battle of Mons-en-Pévèle. Although this battle was not as decisive as Courtrai, it forced the Flemish to enter into peace negotiations. The war continued with varying success for many years. In 1382, 80 years later, the French won a crushing victory over the Flemish at the Battle of Rysbeek. After this battle, they stormed Courtrai, and, in revenge for the humiliation of 1302, removed the golden spurs from the church and took them to Dijon. The further fate of these trophies is unknown. Despite subsequent defeats, the significance of the Battle of Courtrai for Flemish identity cannot be overstated. It became a central myth in the history of Flanders, a symbol of the struggle for freedom and independence. The day of the battle, July 11th, is still a national holiday for the Flemish community in Belgium. This battle showed that unity, discipline, and the proper use of one's strengths can outweigh the apparent superiority of the enemy. It became a lesson not only for the military, but also for politicians. An organized people defending their interests is a force that cannot be ignored. The story of the Battle of the Golden Spurs is not just a tale of a medieval battle. It is a parable of how David can defeat Goliath if he is smart, brave, and fights for a just cause on his own land. In summary, the Battle of Courtrai was a turning point in the military history of the Middle Ages. Its legacy was felt throughout the 14th century and largely determined the further development of military art. It clearly demonstrated the vulnerability of heavy knightly cavalry. The main lesson of the battle was that disciplined infantry, occupying an advantageous defensive position, was capable of withstanding any cavalry attack. This forced commanders throughout Europe to pay more attention to infantry units, their training, and their armament. This marked the beginning of the so-called infantry renaissance. The Flemings demonstrated the importance of combining different types of infantry weapons. The combination of long pikes to stop cavalry and shorter Gutentags for close combat proved extremely effective. This idea of tactical interaction between different types of infantry was further developed. The battle also highlighted the critical importance of reconnaissance and knowledge of the terrain. Robert d'Artois was defeated not only because of the resilience of the Flemish, but also because of his own arrogance and disregard for the terrain of the battlefield. He led his elite army into a trap that he could have easily detected with due diligence. Socially and politically, the victory of the townspeople over the feudal aristocracy had enormous resonance. It demonstrated the growing power of the cities and their ability to defend their interests, not only by economic means, but also by military force. It was one of the harbingers of the decline of classical feudalism. For Flanders itself, the battle became the foundation of national identity. The images of Peter de Koninck, Jan Breidel, and the nameless weavers who stopped the French knights inspired the Flemish for centuries. This heroic epic helped them preserve their culture and language during periods of foreign rule. It is important to understand that Courtrai was not the end of knighthood. Cavalry continued to play an important role on the battlefield for a long time. However, after this battle, no commander could recklessly throw his cavalry at a prepared infantry defense. the battle became a classic example of asymmetric warfare, where the weaker side in the traditional sense uses its unique advantages to defeat a stronger opponent. The Flemings turned their weakness, the lack of cavalry, into a strength by relying on infantry and defense. Their victory was the result of a combination of many factors: the right choice of position, effective weapons, iron discipline, and fatal mistakes by the enemy. But the main reason was the spirit of the Flemish craftsmen, who fought not for glory and plunder, but for their homes, their freedom, and their future. The story of the Battle of Courtrai is a timeless reminder that in war, as in life, it is not always the strongest who wins, but the smartest, the most organized, and those who best understand the rules of the game. We saw how, on the field near the Flemish town of Courtrai, it was not just two armies that clashed, but two different worlds, two different philosophies of war. On the one hand, there was the splendor and power of feudal knighthood. On the other, the harsh discipline and desperate determination of the city's craftsmen. The victory won by the militia went down in history as a symbol that unity and intelligence can overcome brute force. The Battle of the Golden Spurs was a harsh lesson for all of Europe. It showed that times were changing, and that a new force born in the cities was capable of challenging the old order. It was the dawn of a new era, the era of infantry, which would dominate the battlefields for centuries to come. Which of the Flemish tactical decisions do you think was the most ingenious? The choice of location for the battle, the use of unique weapons, or the emphasis on iron discipline? Suggest topics for future videos about the great battles of the past that you would like to see in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new episodes.